So here we are. The elders and the deacons have decorated the sanctuary and indeed large parts of the whole church in anticipation of God coming to earth through the birth of the blessed babe. Josephina has lit the candle of hope. The Little White Chapel elders and deacons, right on cue, did you notice how they did it by the end of the communion hymn, have carried in the Lord's Supper, signifying the beginning of the new liturgical season, the beginning of the retelling of the birth of the good news. All of the vestments in the sanctuary have been changed from the ordinal color of green to the colors of starting, oncoming, invitation, the welcoming of royalty, the procession, the advent of God. Even the preacher has been decorated. But this text from Romans, this text does not mention a royal baby. This text does not mention a humble mother. This text does not mention wise men or angels about which the choir will sing to us in just a few weeks. It is not even a text about a wicked royal king. It is a text after jet lag, after visiting with family. This is a text about staying awake. The Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul had his own great awakening, didn't he? He had never been a part of the original disciples, had he? He had not stood at the foot of the cross, had he? He had not consoled Jesus' mother, had he? But after killing the deacon Stephen and on his way to persecute and kill more followers of Christ's good news, Christ called him on the Damascus road and said, "Why do you persecute me?" And thus began that apostle's new life in Christ. His name was even changed. Saying, "It is no longer I, but Christ who lives in me," Paul died to himself and his Pharisaic tradition. You see, Jewish Paul extracted the story of Christ coming to earth, the descendant of all the patriarchs, the final covenant with all the chosen people, and he placed that story someplace else. Paul understood that with the birth of the Christ, God came to exist among us and change our relationship with God forever. Paul is telling us also that with the crucifixion of Christ, Christ's resurrection and his ascension, we who believe are now living in hope between events and expecting something more. Something's coming. With creation having happened, with the birth of God come to earth, and Christ living among us, showing himself to us and teaching us that all of God's beloved children are welcome to enter God's kingdom, all of that having happened, Paul says we are now called to develop the watchfulness of God, develop a watchfulness for God, and stay awake, watchful for the movement of the God of history, the God of eternity's final move, Christ's return to gather us all to him. Paul says, look past what you see and live in expectation. Live in hope. Paul believed that Christ's birth and everything that happened after it was a miracle in itself and more. It was a sign of what God was yet to do. In creation, in history, God had more to do. Something's coming. The world is a different place when you see the same skies that others see, when you walk the same streets that others walk, when you experience the same rain on Thanksgiving in sunny California that others experience. I'm so sorry, visitors. But you live in watchfulness, anticipation, and hope of something more. Paul writes this about expectation and hope in my favorite Bible verse. Now through a glass darkly, then face to face. Don't give up hope. Curious quality about hope. It cannot coexist with apathy. It cannot coexist with lack of passion. It cannot live with world weariness and ennui. You cannot be constantly distracted, constantly anesthetized, constantly sleeping, and live in hope. Hope in something better coming means something you have to go without. It means that you have to go without something today if you're hoping for something better tomorrow. Sometimes you have to suffer. Kids who have good grades and hope to get into good schools can tell you stories of sometimes staying at home, not going out for a good time, and cracking open the books again, doing extra credit work on the internet. Do they enjoy that work? No, not always. But the hope gives them the discipline to suffer through tedium, through huge workloads, through hours of taking their focus off of themselves. My sister and I were having a conversation Thanksgiving evening, and she said, suffering aligns us with the suffering of Christ. We are in relationship with the one who suffered so much for us. So we dare to hope. But so many of us, me included, with our credit cards and all our new stuff, have traded in pressing forward and suffering and hope, expecting God's new creation to be and God's new thing to be revealed to us. We have traded all that for distraction. I love things that are shiny. I can look at things that are shiny. I have a new computer that's about 6 months old. Before I even work on it, I like to just take it out and look at it. It's shiny. I don't want to hope and pray all the time with Syria. They are having the worst drought in 900 years. I don't want to hope and struggle about unequal voting rights right here in America with another election year coming up. People with proper ID being turned away. I see the homeless outside our doors. I don't want to be in compassion with them all the time. I don't want to suffer through the impeachment hearings and see more bad feelings between people in the country that I love. I don't want to be afraid about my great-nephews entering an age category as teenagers and preteens where they may start to look dangerous to the police, and so the police may be dangerous to them. They are 9 and 11. Too much to suffer through, too much to hope and expect a solution for, too much to implore God to fix. I don't want to suffer anymore. But Paul says you have to. That is the only way you can hope. You've got to look at this world and see it with new eyes. You've got to realize that the God of creation is walking with you to a better day, and you have to open your eyes and look at it in expectation and hope, and you have to suffer. Now, the Apostle Paul hoped for and expected that Jesus was coming back in his own lifetime. Paul's timetable may have been wrong, but his theology wasn't. He understood Christ's birth as a sign. Paul says because we know who God is as revealed through the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we are called to step away from society and step away from our own distractions and live watchful, hopeful, expectant lives regardless of what we see, regardless of what we experience. Always caring for others. Always. So Paul, as we prepare for this first coming again, what will the second coming be? In 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes that Christ will descend with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of the Lord, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Many of you have read Hal Lindsey's book, and he developed that theory in his blockbuster novel, The Late Great Planet Earth. Lindsey tells us to be aware of the increase in the frequency of famines, well, we see that today, of wars, we see that today, and earthquakes. We should all look at those, Lindsey says, as signs indicating the end of the world. A second line of thinking with regard to the parousia, or second coming, is that judgment will occur not at the end of human history, but at each individual's death. It was Jesus who told the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And many of us find great comfort in thinking of our loved ones, no matter what rascals they were on earth, upon their passing, being the recipients of God's grace and finding themselves immediately in the presence of the loving shepherd. I was preaching, and it was Thanksgiving, and my dad was here, the great Scowler. I love that man to death, and I know he is in heaven, and I know that heaven has its hands full. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus spoke mysteriously and symbolically about his second coming. He said it would be much like it was in the days of Noah. Everybody eating and drinking, paying attention to the movement of the Spirit. And in the midst of such confusion, Jesus said that he would come like a thief in the night. Nobody even aware that the Son of God is present, except those who stay awake and live in expectation and hope. Perhaps for us, 2,000 years later, as we wait for Christ, our focus is not on a day of judgment somewhere in the future, but rather we are to be awakened and focused by Jesus about God's radical claims in the here and now. Across the aisle from where you're sitting, about where you are, Dennis, there was a little lady by the name, when I first came here, her name was June Pratt. Soaking wet, June weighed about 10 pounds. She was 97 years old, I believe. And every week she came to church wearing this white wool coat, which she would wrap around her as tightly as she could and sit looking at me during the service like this. Well, there's my father over there smiling, and there's June over there looking like, I thought June hated me.
Yeah.
Come to find out, June couldn't hear. So June came every Sunday to see what she had no idea she was hearing. But she sat in that seat every week. June lived in a lovely little home not too far from here. When I would go to visit June in the winter, her house was ice cold. I don't know if she could afford to heat it. In the summer, her house was boiling hot. I don't know if she could afford to turn on the air conditioner. As I said, she was rail thin. I don't know if she got enough to eat. June told me that her children could not afford to come and visit her and be with her. June had grandchildren that she had never met. She had great-grandchildren that she had never seen, only through pictures that got sent to her. June's days were spent in solitude, and she showed up here at the church driving a car that had to be 30 years old. She said, if it starts, I'll be there. But in spite of all of that, when June's car did start, she drove herself to the schools, and she spent her days helping kids learn to read at 97 years old. In spite of her condition, in spite of her loneliness, in spite of the insufficiency that she may have had to live, her hope and her expectation was on something better for humankind, something better for those coming behind her, till her last day. What the Apostle Paul is saying to us as we look forward to this blessed babe coming into our lives to bless us once again, we are called to multiply that blessing by being a blessing this Advent and this Christmas season to somebody else as never before. What can we do? What can we contribute? What can we be a part of that we haven't done before to make this a better time, to help God move the world to where God is taking the world? That is the story of the oncoming. That is the story of the arrival. That is the story of the gift of the babe.